Howdy, folks. Starting off our last unit, right? We're going to be talking about industrialization, right? So, in unit 5, right, we talked about agriculture, right? That primary sector, you're extracting raw materials from the earth. This unit's focusing on the same type of idea, but we're not dealing with the primary sector. We're shifting towards the secondary or the manufacturing sector. So we're looking at this progression of economic activity. So we're going to look at the origin, and we should be somewhat familiar with the idea of the Industrial Revolution. We've been talking about it since globalization and Malthus back in the day, right? And then the diffusion of that, and kind of the political world today that has been shaped due to the comparative advantage given to European powers. Yeah, here we go. Whoa, lots of text. Okay. The Industrial Revolution. It's like a big deal. It's like everything that's happening like right now in your life, even some of the people in your life wouldn't be around if it wasn't for this period of time of acute innovation. And what I mean by acute, I mean, for the first time in human history, we uncoupled labor from our own physical movement or the strength of an animal or the current of a river. Using the steam engine, we used heat and pressure to create movement. And in doing that, we freed up humanity to do other things, and which is going to eventually lead to the revolution we're in now, right? The digital revolution. The idea that we have time to study, to become highly skilled in other things, right? It all starts here, right? Just as the agricultural, the Neolithic, the second, and then the Green Revolution had ripple effects throughout the world, the Industrial Revolution is a tidal wave. Maybe not initially, but over time, right? That definition there is an important thing to understand, not necessarily memorize, but understand. It's a transition from manual labor to still a type of manual labor, but increased efficiency, and then therefore increased productivity. Cheaper, faster, better, stronger. I don't know if you follow like Daft Punk at all, but what we see is new technologies, right? This focus on producing as much as we can in mass production, but it's not an assembly line yet. Parts that are the same and interchangeable, so they increase productivity, etc. Specifically, the first industry to really take off, well, there are a few, but really it's textiles. We don't think about it often. I mean, we take advantage, we take for granted the amount of clothing we have at our disposal. And you know, it's so comfy, right? It's not wool or leather. So that's what you had, wool or leather, especially in England. So the spinning jenny, the cotton gin, the water frame, what are those things? There's more efficient ways of producing thread at a basic level. That's it. From cotton specifically, because cotton is, well, it's just nicer, right, than wool, etc. So it's doing more with less people. Okay. Resources that are needed. Coal and iron. We see the same kind of thing happening in the United States. And we talked about urbanization a little bit, right? We talked about the steel axis of Pittsburgh, Chicago, and Detroit. The reason those settlements are there is because, well, they have access to waterways, number one. Number two, they're kind of wedged between iron ore, the Mesabi iron range, and lots of coal. Because those two things together, iron ore and coal, make iron and eventually steel, right? Steel is like a really big deal too. We take it for granted, but like it increases the load it can bear. without breaking. It allows us to carry heavier things and also move faster. It allows us to live vertically. If it wasn't for steel, we wouldn't have the density of housing that we do in urban centers. So England was primed for this just because they initially had ample and easily accessible coal deposits, as we can see in that little map there, right? So those settlements grew up around them, right, because they needed to be close to where the coal was. So they become the first really industrial hearths. Steam power, I mentioned it before, right? Steam engine, that's what I'm talking about, right? The Newcomen mentioned the idea that we have pushed our manual labor onto a machine that doesn't get tired, doesn't complain, right? Can work for extended periods of time. Exactly. And that's going to create the factory system, which, things were produced before, but they were regionally in scale, right? They're relatively localized. And it was like this cottage and this cottage, this household, they would do different parts of the process. So it's what's called the cottage industry. So where we have the wool is sheared, it's spun into thread in another household, and then it's woven into like fabric, whatever, a sweater. In another household, and it's dyed a different color in another one, and then it's taken to market. So that was spatially inefficient, but for the time, that's all I could do. So what happens with the factory system is you bring all these components, the beginnings of an assembly line, all in one place. It's mechanized. So this drastic shift from the primary sector to the secondary sector. So we have more and more people that can be supported, right? Fed, clothed, housed, without everyone having to farm. That's the big one. That's the big one. So where does it spread, right? We know the proximity and the gravity model. It's going to diffuse to the closest place first, the largest, closest city. So it starts in England. It's going to migrate to the continental Europe, and eventually to the colonies of European powers. So it goes to colonies of European powers, but those couldn't be colonies without the Industrial Revolution, because the Industrial Revolution is going to give these European powers a lot of power, right? They're technologically advanced. So they're also able to steal and borrow technologies from all over the world and combine them for a singular use. And then we see through colonialism and eventually neo-colonialism and neoliberal policies, industry is everywhere. It's global. It's so global that the places in which it started actually don't do it anymore. I'm not saying that America and Britain don't have manufacturing sectors. We do. They're just not dominant in terms of our actual GDP or economic output. Bigger, faster, stronger. So what's the major impact? 4 things to remember. 4 things to remember. We talked about this before. Food. Produce way more food. And then eventually it's going to lead to like food preservation, like canning of food, right? And that's huge. That stores calories for later, right? Increases life expectancy, etc. But subsequently, the population is going to increase because there is more food. People are going to start moving into cities. They're pushed off the agricultural land because of lack of jobs, because the machines are doing it. By the way, people are super pissed about that. They're called Luddites. And the factory system is born. So then we have this real birth of dense and gritty cities. So we talked last unit about favelas, slums, shanty towns, etc. In the emerging world right now, that was what London and Paris looked like 200 years ago, right? Just with different clothes. And then a big one is new social structure. Because before it was, hey, there was a noble, clergy, and then a peasant, or maybe a knight was in there somewhere. So what this allowed for was like people who were not born with land titles. They weren't born into a wealthy family that owned land or going into the clergy. They had a way of making money. And it creates this new bourgeois, middle income middle class, the owners of capital. They eventually owned the factory, et cetera, and amassed lots of wealth. Right. This is going to shake up old power systems, et cetera. And out of this, we see political movements like, communism as a direct reaction to industrialization and what's seen as exploitation of workers. And by seen, I mean they were exploited. So this is going to shift, especially European mindset in terms of how they would view nature. Nature became less of a formidable force. The wilderness was being tamed due to the technology they had, right? So now I'm going to be seeing nature as something to conquer, right, and overtake versus being somewhat concerned about what nature does to it, right? Big thing that we see even today is Europe is going to gain a comparative advantage. I mentioned this in the last slide, this technological advancement. They have an advantage compared to those societies that don't have the steam engine or the Maxim gun, which is a machine gun, or the benefits of like the scientific and medical revolutions, which allowed Europeans to understand disease in a different way. And using those tools and new knowledge, they were able to really extend their reach and extract raw materials from all around the world, right? And we still see that today because the wealthier countries of today, not all of them, right? But the wealthier countries of the day are old colonial powers that amassed this great wealth during that time period. Okay. And this is what we're talking about. So this emergence of industry, you're going to need raw materials, whether that's rubber, whether that's timber, today, palm oil, things like that. So you have to go find them. You have to go get them. And you don't want to pay for them. So you're just going to use your Maxim gun and your cannon and your steamship to be like, hey, I'm going to take this stuff and I'm going to let you rule, but I'm getting paid. So it allowed for raw extraction of raw materials, right? All those raw materials went to, not all of them, but a lot of them went to the mother colonial power, in which they were turned into finished products, chairs, sure. And well, now we need to sell these chairs somewhere. Where are we going to sell them? Well, I know, we control a market, meaning we control a place to sell. So if you were a Portuguese colony or a British colony or a French colony, you could only trade with France or Portugal or England. That was it. So it cornered the market, literally. It's like, I'm going to take this stuff, turn it into stuff, and you're going to buy it back from me. And you're going to have to, because you can't buy this from anyone else. That's called mercantilism. Merchant mercantilism. And you see this map here, we're talking about this triangular trade. This is just the movement of raw materials and people to be turned into finished products and then sold back. So again, we see this wealth moving towards Europe and eventually towards the United States, right? This mercantilism is the forefront, the beginnings of what we now know as colonialism. There's a video there. I'm not going to play it, but in the Zoom, we'll watch it and kind of see that there's going to be this period of boom, all of a sudden, like Africa, for example, in the 1880s, is all of a sudden colored in. What happened? The Industrial Revolution got to it. Boop. So what else are we concerned with? So that's kind of the, origin and diffusion. It's geography, so we're concerned with spatial arrangements of things. Where is industry located? Well, if we look at von Thunen, right, talking about agriculture, he's saying that certain types of agriculture are going to be more profitable at certain distances from the market. Okay, well, Alfred Weber, he's German, Weber, he produces 100 years ago, it's like 110 years ago, I believe, a theory dealing with optimal location or least cost theory. Least cost means adding value to production, costing less to produce. So he's assuming some things. They're profit driven, just like von Thunen was, that you want to reduce transportation costs, At this point in time, there is rail, so it's not just like walking, right? The car isn't really used when he wrote this. He's concerned with labor costs. And he's concerned with this thing called agglomeration and the benefits of like businesses and services clustering together. So this is like, so in San Diego, for example, in La Mesa, actually, if you go north of the 8 or north of the 8 on like Spring Street, you get to that little industrial park, right? Those businesses benefit from being closer to each other. If you're downtown San Diego, there's a type of agglomeration that happens there where you have like law firms are also near accounting firms and also near like temp services where like secretarial work. Copies used to be a thing, not so much anymore. But those things will all be centered together because they have a symbiotic relationship. They service each other. Okay. Some critiques of his theory. Well, first, let's talk about bulk reducing and bulk gaining. So he's going to outline two specific types of industries. Ones in which gain or lose weight after processing. So for example, bulk reducing industry is going to be closer, see the little thing with gears there, closer to the raw material because that's where it's its heaviest, from the mine to the factory processing center. That's where it's the heaviest. So you want to be close. You want to reduce that cost as much as you can. Once it's processed, it's lighter, and therefore there's less expensive to transport it to market. The inverse is true for bulk gaining industries, where you're actually going to be heavier after the processing, and therefore you're going to be closer to the market because you're going to reduce that transportation cost. Because he's assuming some things. This is one of his critiques, right? That there's only two elements to transport costs, distance and weight. Because again, he's stuck in his historical perspective of we have a locomotive, and there is steel lines, but it's still, it's still hindered by weight and speed. You can only go so fast. They didn't have the efficient supply chains that we have today because it wasn't computerized. Okay. He's also not taking consideration labor. He's assuming that labor is limitless and doesn't move. When in reality, we know you can exhaust labor in an area, meaning there's no more workers left, which is going to increase labor costs. We also know that laborers move. People move for economic gain or decline because of, right? He's also assuming, just like von Thunen, that there's one market. When in reality, there's multiple markets, and the better your transportation network, the more markets you have. And he's not considering any kind of government policy or regulations that we have today, environmental or social, that would deter location from one place to another. It's like the idea that you wouldn't want to live next to an Amazon warehouse necessarily. So bulk reducing, bulk increasing. You're going to be going through an exercise later this week in which you're going to have to apply these terms to an actual industry, find out its best location. Looking here, we're looking at just silver and gold. So and it's showing you there's a market, there's these source centers. Where do I place my processing center, my smelter, to reduce cost? Gold is going to be a bulk reducing industry. Silver is too, because it's from the earth. So you're going to purify it. So you're going to get rid of a lot of the impurities when you boil it down, when you heat it up and crush it, right? And then so the finished product is actually less bulky. Like syrup, anything that's bottled is going to be heavier. It's a bulk gaining industry. Milk, bulk gaining industry. It's actually a weird one when you think about it. Okay, so least cost theory, optimizing profit based on location. Similar theme as we've talked about before. All right, folks. Let's talk about agglomeration. It's like this beautiful symphony of interaction, and it happens in cities for the most part, right? It's that increased economic interaction, it's that increased mobility, it's that increased economic transactions that generates wealth, right? It doesn't have to just be wealth, though. It could be ideas. Two heads are better than one. And services, not just in heavy industry, but like tech firms will agglomerate. They will cluster together. And they could form what's called a base industry. A base industry is what brings people to the settlement, to their region. So Silicon Valley, right? Um, if you're, 10 years ago anyway, maybe it's changing now. But 10 years ago, if you were a software engineer or a computer developer or a designer or a data scientist, guess where you were going? You're probably going to be headed there to Google or Cisco, right, or Adobe, to Silicon Valley, because that's where all the tech jobs were, right? And the more tech workers are there, the more tech jobs will move there because they need that labor force, right? We have one in San Diego. We have like a little tech pole, Sorrento Valley, parts of Rancho Bernardo and Forest Ranch, like Qualcomm. Qualcomm's the big one, right? So we see increased urbanization with this, but that base economy, base service, base industry, whatever it is that brings people there initially, is going to bring in non-basic services, non-basic industries. So these are supporting services like accounting or law firm, warehousing, shipping, whatever whatever it is. Those other businesses that serve the larger economic foundation. You also need people, right? Well, people need services, either commercial, so you're going to have like grocery stores or entertainment. And you're also going to have a government system put in place to accommodate the infrastructural needs, but also like schools and roads and things like such. Things like such. Okay. Just looking at some of these maps, right? That's Silicon Valley, just pointing out some tech hubs. Also, the thing about high tech, that labor pool is already there, right? The reason why Google and all these were founded there is because, I mean, you have Stanford, you have Berkeley, you have Caltech is just a little bit to the south. You have a lot of higher learning in the technological field happening there, so that labor force is there. Got it. In San Diego and in Southern California, really is aerospace. San Diego used to be huge in terms of aerospace engineering, military base, right? So looking at that one below, we see the percentage of population with a 4-year degree, right? Those regions are going to attract high-tech, high-skilled industries to them because they're looking for that labor force, or they're trying to attract them to move. Texas is doing this right now by luring big tech industries to Texas by giving them tax breaks and jacking up their electrical grid. Over here, we're looking at the United States, right? And this gives you some stats of where manufacturing happens, right? We kind of take for granted or don't think about it, but like the United States still produces a lot of stuff. There's a lot more of it's automated and mechanized now. And that really leads us to this idea of this fourth industrial revolution, which we're in. This period of time in which machines are taking on more and more of our tasks and increasingly complex tasks. And as in terms of like putting things together, even just doing math, right? Well, that's what computers really are. They're calculators. But anyway, yeah, that's agglomeration and this kind of symphony of this hyper connect. Everything's connected, right? You bring a base service in, other things come in. It grows. Growth creates growth, right? All right, folks. Air high five. Talk to you later. Is that a question?